Hi there, I'm Adam Smith.
And I'm Carly Stevenson.
And we've put together this short video to mark the literature of the country house, to celebrate the course as it draws to a close. I certainly can't remember what life was like before this course started. Can you remember, Carly?
Honestly, I can't. But we have had a fantastic time sort of having conversations with you all. And as a sort of farewell video, we thought we'd offer a kind of further reading exercise if you wanted to participate.
Yeah, so if you're wondering what you're going to read next now that the course has come to a close, we've got a few ideas. This is far from an exhaustive list though. This is just books that we like and we've read and we enjoy that involve the country house, and they're books that we hope you'll enjoy too.
The first text I would recommend is actually a collection of texts from Lord Byron, romantic poet of the sort of second wave of romantic poets. The reason why is because he has a connection with Newstead Abbey, which is an English country house in Nottinghamshire. And it's Byron's ancestral home, which was previously owned by the 5th Baron Byron, who was known as the Wicked Lord. So that fits in really well with the malevolent Gothic house owner week. There's no particular poem that I'd recommend. I'd more or less recommend anything that Byron has written, because he really sort of embodies this idea of a lord and of sort of this flamboyant, rich house owner, and how you can contrast that with his history and his great uncle, the Wicked Lord, and how he dealt with being a proper country house owner.
My first choice, which I've picked from my own stomping ground, the literature of the long 18th century, might sound like an odd suggestion at first. It's Laurence Sterne's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, which appeared across 9 volumes between 1759 and 1767. And this novel is widely acknowledged as being one of the most important novels of the 18th century, and for my money, I think it's one of the most important novels of all time. In fact, scratch that. I think, for my money, it's the most important novel of all time. Playfully described as Steve Coogan as being proto-postmodern in the adaptation of sorts of Cock and Bull story, this novel charts the narrator's impossibly self-conscious attempts to chart his own life and his own opinions. And as he attempts to script his own autobiography, he's plagued by increasingly existential questions. What should he include? How much detail should he go into? Where should he begin? And most importantly, what does it actually mean to write a life? Tristram decides to start with his own conception, but as the narrative progresses, he continually changes his mind, fluctuating backwards and forwards in jarring instances of prolepsis and analepsis, and famously repeats the mantra throughout the novel, "I'm getting ahead of myself, I'm not yet born." But one constant throughout the story, both before and after Tristram is born, in his house, the same house that his mother, his father and his uncle Toby lived in before him, is Shandy Hall. The house doesn't change, and arguably the novel could be as much about the story of Shandy Hall as it is the story of its inhabitants. And remarkably, Laurence Sterne actually named his own house Shandy Hall, and you can still visit that today in the Cotswold, just on the outskirts of York.
So the second, third and fourth texts that I would recommend all come in one kind of unit, because they're all adaptations of the first text I'm going to talk about, which is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. So Jane Eyre is obviously centred around sort of this male lead character for quite a lot of the story, as well as obviously Jane Eyre herself. And the sort of country home belonging to Rochester is called Thornfield, which is allegedly based on quite a number of different houses, just depending on who you trust and who you believe. But one of those suggestions is Haddon Hall, which we visited in week 5. So that would be the first out of the 3 that I'm going to recommend. And the second one would be a more modern adaptation of Jane Eyre, which is Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. And Rebecca is set again around a country house called Mandalay, which is owned by another sort of, not quite a Byronic hero, but in that kind of vein. So you get this kind of Jane Eyre-esque novel, which is set in the 20th century, and you have a heroine who's very like Jane Eyre in a lot of ways, but obviously there's a modern twist on that. And then, to complement both of those two, we have a really great text called Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, which is another 20th century text, which is another adaptation of Jane Eyre as well. So in the 20th century, you get these two sorts of adaptations of Jane Eyre emerging, where they've taken the original story and given a different perspective. And in the case of Wide Sargasso Sea, the writer, Jean Rhys, actually gives a voice to the mad woman in the attic. So it's a really interesting perspective if you're interested in Jane Eyre.
Another text that came up a lot when we were discussing Oscar Wilde, this idea that house owners looked to wealthy American dowagers to help sustain their diminishing incomes, was the book The Buccaneers by Edith Wharton. And this was actually Edith Wharton's final novel, tantalisingly left unfinished when she died in 1937. The book was published in 1938 as it stood, and that story in the book revolves around 5 wealthy and ambitious American girls, their guardians, and the titled, landed but crucially impoverished Englishmen who married them as the girls participate in the London season in search for titled English gentlemen for matrimonial purposes. Interestingly, in the 1990s, there were competing attempts to try and finish the story, with Wharton scholar Marianne Mannering providing an ending in 1993 in an edition that was published with Penguin, and then in the same year the BBC hiring a scriptwriter, Maggie Wadley, to attempt to finish the novel for a television series which was broadcast in 1995. My next suggestion is actually a Charles Dickens story you might not have heard of. It's not as famous as some of the others, but it's called The Haunted House. And the house in question probably isn't technically a country house, but nevertheless Dickens does do fascinating things here with the house as a space. The Haunted House was published in All the Year Round as well, which of course you'll remember from our week on Great Expectations, as that was also printed in his periodical All the Year Round. So the story was billed in this periodical as being conducted by Charles Dickens, with contributions from other authors. It was a portmanteau story, with Dickens writing the opening and closing stories to frame the stories by other contributors, 5 other contributors, and each story looked at a different room in this house. So you've got Dickens' first one, the mortars in the house, but then you have stories like the ghosts in the clock room, the ghosts in the double room, the ghosts in the picture room. And actually it's really interesting if you look at the journal, which is freely available on Dickens Journals Online, to have a look at who some of these contributors are. Some names might sound familiar. So you've got the ghosts in the cupboard room, written by one Wilkie Collins. You've also got the ghost in the garden room by someone else you may have heard of, Elizabeth Gaskell. Dickens had already begun a tradition of Christmas publications with A Christmas Carol, which came out in 1843, and his Christmas stories soon became a national institution. The Haunted House, which I'll recommend today, was his 1859 offering. And if you'd like to read the whole thing, you can find it on Dickens Journal Online. A very famous novel that you've perhaps heard of, maybe not read, but that is definitely worth a look. It's Evelyn Waugh's novel of 1945, Brideshead Revisited. Narrated by the middle-aged artist and Second World War captain Charles Ryder, Brideshead Revisited tells the story of his involvement with the Flight family, Catholic aristocrats whose family seat is the splendid Brideshead Castle of the title. The book was infamously adapted by the BBC in the 1980s in a production which used Yorkshire's very own Castle Howard as its filming location. Of course, talking of Evelyn Waugh also brings to my mind the wonderful Jeeves and Wooster stories of P.G. Wodehouse, which are all set in and around the country house.
Finally, the 5th book I'd recommend is another country house gothic novel, which is called The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters, and that was published in 2009, so it's a lot more recent than the other texts I've recommended. But, like Jane Eyre and its 2 20th century adaptations, it has this very central character of the house almost. The house almost fulfills another role as a character. And also, kind of like Jane Eyre and its contemporary adaptations, there's a sense of haunting, which may or may not be actually supernatural, but maybe the haunting of the past, perhaps. I think this is a really great one to read, because it sort of sets the English country house in a modern context. And like with Oscar Wilde's text that we've studied on the course, you sort of get this impression of the dissolution of the aristocracy and the fact that the country house is becoming kind of a faded memory. It's disintegrating.
Finally, an absolute favourite of mine, which actually incorporates lots of the elements from the stories that I've picked, all in the same story, is the much more recent Remains of the Day, written in 1989 by Kazuo Ishiguro. Here, our narrator, Stevens the butler, recalls his life in the form of a diary, while the action continues to progress in the present tense. Much of the novel is concerned with Stevens' professional and personal relationships, a main storyline being his relationship with housekeeper Miss Kenton. Juxtaposing the duty of his job with dignity, the public spaces and the private spaces, and ultimately progress and tradition, This book also emblematises many of the themes, tropes and traits that we've unearthed throughout the history of the literature of the country house in this course.
So there you have it, our top 10 country house pieces of literature which we recommend to you if you want some further reading.
And this is our final opportunity to speak to you all, and I would just like to say thank you so much. The last 8 weeks have been so rich, so exciting, so interesting, so endlessly fascinated, and thank you to all of the contributions, every post, every opinion, every picture, every creative writing piece. It really has been absolutely remarkable.
We've had a great time responding to your comments, reading discussions, giving feedback, and we really hope you've had a good experience on the Country House Lit MOOC. Thank you.
Thanks very much.